The Pacific Ocean, June 1944. Two forces moving toward each other, and neither one can see the other yet. On one side, a wall of steel. American carriers stretched across miles of open water. Pilots strapped into cockpits, engines idling, waiting for a word that hadn't come yet. Instruments flickering, radio chatter clipped and cold. On the other side, something different, something desperate. Japanese aviators, some of them barely old enough to shave, climbing into aircraft they had flown. A handful of times, maybe a dozen. Their commanding officers had made promises, big promises. They were told this mission would change the course of the war. They were told the Americans were tired, overextended, vulnerable. They believed it. Hundreds of aircraft launched from carrier decks in the Philippine Sea, formation after formation rising into the morning sky, heading east. The Americans already knew they were coming, not from a scout, not from a spy, from a machine. Radar signals bounced across the horizon, painting green dots on screens inside darkened combat information centers. Officers plotted intercept vectors with cold precision. Fighter directors picked up their radio handsets. The Hellcats were already airborne before the first Japanese pilot spotted the American fleet. What followed was not a battle. It was a reckoning. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was the largest carrier versus carrier engagement in the history of naval warfare. It unfolded over 2 days, June 19 and 20 of 1944, in the waters west of the Mariana Islands. The United States Navy, under Admiral Raymond Spruance, had just launched the invasion of Saipan. Japan could not allow that island to fall. It sat within range of the new B-29 Superfortress bombers. Lose Saipan. Lose the ability to protect the home islands from the air. So Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa assembled the most powerful carrier force Japan had fielded since Midway. 9 carriers, 473 aircraft, veteran surface ships. A plan built on a key advantage. Japanese carrier aircraft had a longer operational range than American planes. The idea was simple: strike from beyond American reach, hit hard, win. On the American side, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded Task Force 58, 15 carriers, 891 aircraft, and pilots, who had been flying combat for years. But the real asymmetry wasn't in numbers, it was in experience, in technology, in the gap between what Japan had left and what America had built. The Japanese Navy had bled itself dry at Coral Sea, Midway, the Solomon Islands campaign. Every engagement cost pilots it could not replace. By 1944, the training pipeline had collapsed under pressure. New aviators arrived at their units with fewer than 300 hours of total flight time. Some had far less. The Americans waiting for them had thousands. The sun rose early over Task Force 58. It always did, this far out in the Pacific. Aboard the carriers, the day had already been in motion for hours before dawn. Mechanics worked under red-filtered flashlights, checking hydraulic lines, patching oxygen fittings, loading belts of .50 caliber ammunition into the wings of the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. Coffee was bad, sleep had been worse, nobody complained. The Hellcat was not a pretty aircraft. It was wide, heavy. It sat on its landing gear with the slightly stubborn posture of something that knew how much it weighed and didn't apologize for it. Where the Japanese Zero was elegant, long-limbed, aerodynamic to the point of looking fragile, the Hellcat looked like it had been designed by someone who had been in a fight before and intended to win the next one. It had been. Grumman engineers built the Hellcat after studying every scrap of intelligence American pilots could report about the Zero. They understood the problem. The Zero outturned, outclimbed, and outranged almost everything the United States had put in the air in 1941 and 42. The FF-4F Wildcat had held on through sheer tactics and stubbornness, but holding on was not the same as winning. The Hellcat was the answer. Its engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800, produced 2,000 horsepower. It gave the aircraft a top speed of roughly 370 miles per hour at altitude. The Zero could not match that at high speed. The Hellcat could dive away from trouble or chase down anything trying to run. 6 .50 caliber machine guns in the wings, armor plating around the cockpit, a self-sealing fuel tank that didn't burst into flame the moment a round passed through it. Japanese pilots called the Zero their sword, thin, sharp, lethal, if it could reach you. The Hellcat was a different kind of weapon, something closer to a wall. Commander David McCampbell sat in the ready room of USS Essex that morning, going through his notes. McCampbell was 34 years old. He had flown combat missions across the Pacific. He knew how the Japanese attacked. He knew the formations they favored, the altitudes they preferred, the moment in a turn when they became momentarily vulnerable. He wasn't nervous. The pilots under his command weren't nervous either, not in the way the word usually means. There was tension, yes, the kind that sharpens attention, makes hands steadier, not shakier. Meanwhile, aboard the ships, something else was working. The combat information centers had been active since before midnight. Radar operators tracked surface contacts, air contacts, anything that moved. The systems aboard American ships in 1944 were sophisticated beyond what Japan had fully accounted for. Long-range radar could detect incoming aircraft at distances the Japanese assumed were safe. At 09:59, a radar return appeared on the screens. Distance, approximately 150 miles. Bearing, west. It wasn't one aircraft. It wasn't a patrol. The return was wide, dense, and growing. Fighter director officers began vectoring Hellcats immediately, not to the edge of the fleet's protection. Out, far ahead, into clean air, where the intercept could happen away from the ships and their guns. The order went out across the radio frequencies. "Hey, Rippers, look at the size of that flight." The Hellcats climbed. They climbed fast into the high, thin air where engines breathed harder and the temperature dropped below what instruments could comfortably read. They climbed because altitude was leverage. Altitude meant speed in a dive, and speed was how you lived. Below them, the fleet moved in clean formation across flat water. Above them, still invisible to the eye, still just a collection of green smears on a radar screen. The Japanese were coming. Aboard the Japanese carriers, the mood that morning was something complicated. Pride was part of it. The Imperial Japanese Navy carried a tradition that went back generations. These men believed in what they were doing with a conviction that had no equivalent in doubt. They had been told this operation, codenamed AGO, would be decisive, that the Americans, stretched across a broad invasion front, would finally be caught exposed. Admiral Ozawa had constructed the plan carefully. His carriers would remain beyond the range of American aircraft. Japanese planes, flying up to 600 miles on a single mission, would strike the American fleet, refuel at Guam or Rota, and strike again on the return. A relay attack. A tactic that exploited the one advantage Japan's aircraft still held: range. The plan had logic to it. What it didn't have was margin. The pilots launched that morning represented what remained of the Kido Butai, the carrier strike force that had opened the war at Pearl Harbor and swept across the Pacific in the early months of the conflict. What remained was not what had started. The experienced aviators were mostly gone. At Coral Sea, at Midway, at Santa Cruz. In the grinding attrition of the Guadalcanal campaign, where the Americans had traded losses and kept feeding men and aircraft into the furnace until the Japanese pipeline ran dry. By 1944, the average Japanese carrier pilot arriving for combat duty had accumulated somewhere between 100 and 250 hours of flight time. Some estimates put certain pilots considerably lower than that. In a Navy that had once required 1,500 hours before a man could fly combat from a carrier, this was not a tradition. It was an emergency measure. The training had been compressed, shortened, prioritized for quantity over depth. Men who should have spent months learning instrument flying, formation tactics, gunnery, had instead been pushed through truncated courses and handed an assignment. The aircraft themselves were not without merit. The Mitsubishi A6 M0 was still a remarkable machine in 1944. In the right hands, it could outmaneuver almost anything in the sky. Its range was exceptional. Its climb rate at lower altitudes remained competitive. Pilots who truly understood it could do things with it that seemed to defy physics. But the Zero's design philosophy had a cost. To achieve its legendary performance, Mitsubishi's engineers had stripped away weight wherever they could find it. Armor plating, minimal. Self-sealing fuel tanks, absent. Structural reinforcement around critical components, reduced to near nothing. A Zero hit by accurate fire didn't limp. It came apart. American pilots had learned this early. One good burst, and the aircraft simply ceased to exist in any recognizable form. The Japanese pilots climbing into the sky that morning understood the stakes. Most of them had been told what they were flying into. Some had written letters. Some had observed private rituals. The culture they came from did not encourage the expression of doubt. But doubt has a way of finding expression anyway. In a grip slightly too tight on a control stick. In eyes that scan a horizon just a fraction too fast. In a formation that clusters a little too close, seeking comfort in proximity that tactics did not recommend. They flew east, 373 aircraft in successive waves, organized into 4 major attack groups, timed to arrive and overwhelm. The lead elements crossed over Guam, where American fighters had already been dispatched to clear the airfield. They had no way of knowing that. They also had no way of knowing that somewhere ahead, already at altitude, already turning into an intercept bearing, hundreds of Hellcats were waiting. The radar had already done its work. The Hellcats had already climbed, and the first wave was already being tracked to the mile. At 10:23 in the morning, the first Hellcat pilot saw them. Not a dot, not a smear on glass, a wall. Hundreds of aircraft stacked at multiple altitudes, catching the Pacific sun on their canopies and wing surfaces, glinting like scattered metal across a sky that had been empty a moment before. Zeros in the lead. Nakajima Jill torpedo bombers behind them. Judy dive bombers stepped above. Formation discipline, reasonable for green pilots. The radio transmission came back flat and almost casual. Tally-ho. Then, immediately after, the remark that would outlive the battle itself. Lieutenant Commander Paul Bowie, watching the incoming waves from the cockpit of his Hellcat, keyed his radio and said something that no military report would ever quite capture with full dignity. He compared what he was looking at to a shooting gallery, a duck shoot, the kind you found at a county fair back home. He wasn't wrong, but the men in those incoming aircraft were not ducks. They were pilots, young men, most of them, flying into something they had been told they could survive. The intercept geometry was already locked. American fighter directors had done their work with cold precision, placing the Hellcat formations at altitudes above the incoming waves, with the sun at their backs where possible. Altitude, speed, position. The 3 things a fighter pilot wants before a fight. The Americans had all 3. The Japanese formations pressed on. At this point, turning back was not a concept their orders accommodated. The mission was to reach the American fleet. Some of the pilots in the trailing waves could not yet see the Hellcats dropping toward the lead elements. The radio channels were already beginning to fill with voices, overlapping, some calm, some not. The distance closed at a rate that arithmetic made pitiless. 2 opposing forces, closing at a combined speed of over 600 miles per hour. At 2 miles, the silhouettes became individual aircraft. At 1 mile, the silhouettes became men. The Hellcats came down out of the sun in slashing high-speed passes, not circling, not entering the turning fights where the Zero's maneuverability could become a factor. They came through the formations at speeds the Japanese aircraft could not match in a straight line, firing in short, controlled bursts, pulling up and repositioning for another pass. The tactics had a name: energy fighting. Keep your speed. Never let it bleed away in a slow radius turn where a lighter, nimbler aircraft could walk around behind you. Convert altitude to speed. Convert speed to altitude. Attack from a position of advantage. And if you lose that advantage, disengage and rebuild it. American pilots had trained for this, drilled it, internalized it. For many of the Japanese pilots meeting them now, it was the first time they had ever seen it applied at full scale by men who had done it before. The leading edge of the Japanese first wave began to disintegrate. Not slowly, not gradually. The way a wave disintegrates when it hits a seawall. What happened next lasted most of the day. It was not one battle. It was a sequence of engagements, spread across hundreds of miles of sky, layered at different altitudes, broken into dozens of individual combats that a historian can only reassemble afterward from after-action reports and gun camera film and the accounts of men who came back. The Japanese sent 4 major waves. The first, launched around 0830 from the carrier Taiho and the fleet carriers of Cardiff 1, numbered 69 aircraft. American radar picked it up at approximately 150 miles. The Hellcats were already at altitude and inbound when the wave was still over open water. The intercept happened before a single Japanese aircraft reached the outer edge of the American fleet's screen. Roughly 42 of those 69 aircraft never returned. The second wave, larger, nearly 128 aircraft, followed similar vectors. Fighter director officers aboard the flagships tracked it with the same cold efficiency. More Hellcats were launched. The wave reached closer to the fleet than the first, but not much closer. Of 128 aircraft, 97 did not come back. The third wave had the worst navigation of the four. Large portions of it failed to locate the American fleet at all. Some aircraft, low on fuel, diverted toward Guam and Rota. American fighters had already been vectored to those airfields. The planes that landed were caught on the ground or in landing patterns, slow. Their pilots focused on the approach, their fuel nearly exhausted. It was, by any measure, not a fight. The fourth wave found a portion of the American fleet but suffered the same result. Hellcats cut through the formations with the systematic efficiency of men who had been doing this long enough that it had stopped feeling like anything except work. Throughout all of this, the anti-aircraft guns of the American surface ships contributed substantially to the total. The proximity-fused shell, introduced in the Pacific campaign, detonated not on contact, but when it passed within lethal range of an aircraft. It turned the airspace above the fleet into something a Japanese pilot could not fly through at low altitude without encountering a burst of steel shrapnel from a direction he could not predict. The numbers at the end of the day were not ambiguous. Japan lost somewhere between 346 and 396 aircraft, depending on the accounting method. American combat losses, 23 aircraft to enemy action. Additional planes were lost operationally in the night recovery that followed, when Mitchell made the decision to light his carriers fully in darkness to bring his pilots home, accepting the risk of submarine attack rather than let trained men go into the water. That decision alone said something. It said that what was aboard those aircraft mattered more than the ships themselves. The Japanese pilots, who did return, landed on carriers that had almost nothing left to launch. Ozawa, not yet fully aware of the scale of what had happened, planned to continue the offensive the following morning. He would discover by sunrise that he could not. By the evening of June 19, 1944, the arithmetic was done. Japan had launched the largest carrier airstrike of the entire Pacific War. It had attempted to destroy the American fleet protecting the invasion of Saipan. It had sent its best remaining aircraft and its most committed pilots into the Philippine Sea with a plan built on range and concentration of force. What came back was a remnant. Ozawa lost 3 carriers that day, and the next, 2 of them to American submarines before the air battle even peaked. Shokaku, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, went down with catastrophic losses. Taiho, the newest and largest carrier in the Japanese fleet, was lost to a single torpedo that ignited aviation fuel vapors in a design flaw nobody had anticipated. She sank before the battle was decided. The air groups were functionally destroyed. The experience those pilots carried, the institutional knowledge accumulated through years of combat across the Pacific, the particular skill that comes only from having survived dozens of engagements and absorbed their lessons. Most of it went into the water or the sky above the Philippine Sea on June 19th. It could not be rebuilt, not in the time Japan had left. The Mariana Islands fell, Saipan, Tinian, Guam. From Tinian, B-29 superfortresses would eventually fly the missions that ended the war in August of 1945. The strategic logic Ozawa had been trying to prevent played out exactly as the Americans had planned. The battle itself generated a nickname almost immediately. Commander Paul Bui's radio transmission, comparing the interceptions to a fairground game, circulated through the fleet within hours. By the time the after-action reports were being written, the name was already fixed: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It has been questioned over the decades. Some historians argue it understates the courage of the Japanese pilots who flew into an intercept they had no means to avoid. Others note that it accurately describes what the engagement looked like from the American side: systematic, one-directional, almost without suspense. Both things can be true at the same time. The men who did not come back were not incompetent. They were undertrained, under-equipped, fed into a tactical situation that their commanders had misjudged and their aircraft could not correct. They flew anyway. The war had made that the only option left to them. For the United States Navy, June 19th was a confirmation. The Hellcat worked, the training pipeline worked. The radar networks and fighter direction systems worked. The industrial base that had replaced every ship lost at Pearl Harbor, and then built more, had worked. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never again mount a carrier offensive. What came after were different kinds of attacks, desperate ones. The age of the great fleet engagements was over. History keeps score, but it doesn't always explain what the numbers mean. 380 aircraft on one side, 23 on the other. That ratio is so extreme it barely registers as a battle. It reads more like a training exercise that went wrong for one of the participants. But strip away the outcome, and what you find is something older than any navy. Two groups of men, shaped by different nations, different beliefs, different amounts of sleep and fuel and flight hours, met above open water, and each one of them made the same calculation in the moment. The silhouette of an enemy aircraft filled a gun sight. They all chose to continue. The Americans had every advantage that preparation, industry, and time could provide. They won decisively, and they knew they would, and they were right. The Japanese pilots had almost none of those advantages. They flew anyway. That is not a contradiction. It is simply the full picture. Wars are decided by logistics, by industrial output, by radar systems and armor plating, and the number of hours a pilot has spent in a cockpit before someone starts firing at him. The side that invested in those things won. But the men who flew into the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944, on both sides of the intercept, carried something no production chart has ever been able to measure. The score was 380 to 23. The Philippine Sea recorded it without comment, and the Pacific kept moving.